The car stopped at the edge of the snow-covered forest. The son stepped out first, opened the trunk, set an old tent on the ground, then turned away without looking back. "Just for a little while," he said, avoiding their eyes. "It's quiet here. You'll be fine." The door slammed shut. The engine roared to life, leaving two aging figures standing in the biting cold. They didn't understand why they had been left behind. Only that no one was coming for them, and in the silent forest fresh footprints pressed into the snow, belonging to a man who once walked away from war and a canine who had never abandoned anyone. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, hit subscribe so you never miss another tale of loyalty, courage, and heart. Your support truly means the world. The forest was silent beneath a pale winter sky, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every breath feel louder than it should. Daniel Reed moved carefully along the narrow trail, his boots crunching softly through the thin layer of snow. At 39, his body still carried the strength of a soldier, but his movements were slower now, more deliberate. Broad shoulders filled his heavy jacket, and faint lines cut deep around his eyes, marks not of age, but of nights spent awake, haunted by things no one else could see. A short, neatly trimmed beard framed a jaw that once carried confidence, now shaped by restraint and exhaustion. He had served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, leading reconnaissance and extraction missions through mountain terrain that never forgave mistakes. During his final deployment, an ambush took everything from him: his unit, his sense of certainty, and the belief that surviving meant winning. He came home with no visible wounds, but the war had followed him back in quieter, crueler ways. Sleep rarely lasted more than an hour. Sudden sounds made his muscles lock, and guilt, constant, unrelenting guilt, settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. That was why he lived here now, near the National Forest, working part-time with a local ranger unit. The woods didn't judge. They didn't ask questions. They simply existed. Beside him walked Rex. The German shepherd was 7 years old, his black and tan coat dusted with frost. A faint scar traced one ear, and his movements were slower than they used to be, but his eyes were sharp, watchful, loyal, intelligent. Rex had served beside Daniel in combat, trained to detect danger before it arrived. He, too, carried the memory of explosions, of chaos, of loss. Since the ambush, he had become unusually sensitive to distress, especially human fear. That afternoon, as the pale light began to fade, Rex suddenly stopped. His body tensed. A low growl rolled from his chest. Daniel followed the direction of his gaze and heard it, a faint sound carried by the wind. Not the creak of branches or the cry of an animal. A cough, human, weak, struggling. Daniel moved fast. Through the thinning trees, he saw it, a small, battered tent, half buried in snow, its fabric sagging under the cold. It looked out of place, fragile against the wilderness. Inside were 2 people. An elderly woman sat curled inward, her thin frame trembling. Her hair, once dark, was now streaked with silver and pulled loosely behind her neck. Her lips were pale, her hands shaking as she tried to hold them together for warmth. Beside her sat an elderly man, his shoulders hunched protectively around her. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but alert. He leaned toward her, shielding her from the wind with his own body, even as his hands shook from the cold. Daniel knelt immediately. "I'm here," he said gently. "You're not alone." The man looked up, confusion and disbelief mixing in his eyes. We didn't think anyone would come." Daniel wrapped his insulated jacket around the woman's shoulders, then poured warm water from his flask into a cup, guiding it carefully to her lips. Rex lay beside her without command, pressing his body against hers, sharing what warmth he could. "How long have you been here?" Daniel asked softly. The man swallowed. "Almost a week. Maybe more." Daniel's jaw tightened. A week out here would have killed most people. The woman whispered, her voice barely sound. "Our son. He said it was just for a little while." Daniel felt something inside him crack. He had heard many stories in his life, stories of war, of loss, of violence, but this one landed differently. This wasn't chaos. This was choice. As he scanned the area, he saw the truth written clearly. The careful placement of the tent, the lack of tracks leaving the area, the absence of any supplies beyond what desperation could carry. This wasn't an accident. They had been left here. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He wrapped the woman's hands in a thermal wrap and checked her pulse. Weak, but there. "You're safe now," he said, though part of him wasn't sure it was true yet. Behind them, snow began to fall again, light and silent. And just beyond the tree line, unseen by the world, a line had been crossed, not by the cold, but by human cruelty. Daniel Reed rose slowly, resolve hardening in his chest. This was no accident. This was abandonment, and he would not walk away. The temperature dropped faster than Daniel expected. By the time the light fully faded, the cold had sharpened into something that bit through fabric and bone alike. The forest no longer felt still. It pressed in from every direction, quiet but heavy, as if watching. Daniel tried his radio again. Static. Nothing else. The road would remain closed through the night. He knew that much. The storm had iced over the higher elevations, and no rescue team would make it through until morning, if the weather allowed it at all. So he stayed. Not as a hero, not as a savior, just a man who refused to walk away. He crouched beside the tent and studied it carefully. The fabric was thin, stretched brittle by age. The stakes barely held. Snow had already begun collecting along the edges, seeping inside with quiet persistence. "We'll reinforce this," Daniel said, not as reassurance, but as fact. He used spare cord from his pack to secure the corners, pressing frozen soil down with his boots. He shifted fallen branches against the windward side to break the gusts. Every movement was slow, deliberate, measured by years of experience and an understanding that panic wasted energy. Inside, the elderly woman shivered violently. Her name, she told him, was Evelyn. She was small, barely over 5 feet, her once dark hair now silver and uneven where she'd cut it herself. Her skin was thin and pale, stretched tight across fragile bones. Yet her eyes remained clear, watchful, intelligent, painfully aware of everything happening around her. Her husband, Harold, sat close beside her. He was taller, though age had bent his posture forward. His hands trembled constantly, whether from cold or something deeper Daniel couldn't yet tell. His beard was gray and uneven, and his eyes, sharp despite exhaustion, never stopped tracking Evelyn's breathing. Daniel handed them both thermal blankets. "Wrap these tight," he said. "No gaps." They obeyed without question. Rex crawled forward next, pressing his warm body against Evelyn's side. She flinched at first, then slowly relaxed as the dog's heat soaked through her layers. "Good boy," she whispered. Rex didn't move. Daniel noticed small details then, things most people would miss. A plastic bottle tucked inside Harold's coat, still faintly warm. A grocery bag wrapped around Evelyn's ankles beneath her socks. A second shirt worn backward beneath her coat for insulation. These weren't accidents. These were strategies. "You've done this before," Daniel said quietly. Harold met his eyes, hesitated, then nodded. "You learn fast when you don't have a choice." The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. Snow hissed against the tent walls like sand. Daniel divided what little food he had, 2 energy bars and a packet of dried fruit, into careful portions. He handed the larger share to Evelyn without comment. She tried to refuse. He met her gaze calmly. "You need it more." She didn't argue again. Time moved strangely after that. Minutes stretched. The forest creaked. Somewhere far away, something howled. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to remind them how small they were. Daniel stayed alert, shifting his weight to keep circulation moving. His knee throbbed from an old injury, a souvenir from a rooftop extraction gone wrong years ago. Pain had become familiar, manageable. Fear, however, was something else. Evelyn began to shiver harder, her breath shallow. Daniel leaned closer. "Stay with me. Talk to me." She smiled faintly. "We've had colder nights." Harold nodded. "First apartment we ever had. No heat. We slept in coats." Evelyn let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. "You used to warm my hands because mine were always cold." "I still would," Harold said, voice breaking. Daniel looked away, pretending to adjust the tarp. He had seen bravery on battlefields, but this quiet endurance cut deeper. The minutes dragged. Then an hour. Then more. Daniel kept checking their pulses, their breathing. He pressed warm packs into their hands. He spoke when the silence grew too heavy, grounding them with simple things. His name, the sound of the wind, the promise that morning would come. Still, he knew the truth. They were surviving, not living. And survival had limits. As the night stretched on, Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same pressure he'd felt years ago when he couldn't save everyone. He had learned then that courage didn't always mean action. Sometimes it meant staying when walking away would hurt less. The forest whispered around them. Snow continued to fall, and somewhere beneath the cold, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the quiet suffering of two people who had been left behind, something else stirred. Resolve. Daniel looked down at them, then at Rex, who lifted his head as if sensing the shift. "This isn't the end," Daniel murmured. "I promise." But, even as he said it, he understood something with painful clarity. They hadn't survived this long because of luck. They had survived because they refused to stop fighting. And now, they were no longer alone. The night did not end. It simply stretched. Thin, aching, endless, like breath held too long in the cold. Daniel stayed close, but silent, sitting just outside the tent while the forest breathed around them. The fire he had built earlier had burned low, reduced to embers that glowed faintly beneath ash. Rex lay near the opening, alert but still, his ears twitching at every distant sound. The wind had softened, but the cold remained, crawling beneath layers of cloth and bone. Inside the tent, Harold and Evelyn lay side by side, wrapped in borrowed warmth and memory. Sleep came in fragments. When it broke, they spoke, not loudly, not fully awake, just enough to keep each other anchored. "Do you remember that little house on Cedar Street?" Evelyn whispered, her voice thin but steady. "The one with the crooked porch?" Harold smiled faintly. "The one that leaned like it might fall over if the wind changed its mind." She nodded. "We couldn't afford heat that first winter." "We couldn't afford much of anything," he replied. They shared a quiet breath, then another. "We worked so many jobs back then," she said. "I cleaned offices at night. You fixed fences all day. And still came home smelling like paint," he said softly. "You hated that." Evelyn let out the faintest laugh, fragile as frost. "I hated how tired you were." Their voices trembled, not from the cold alone, but from the weight of remembering. They spoke of mornings when they skipped meals so their children could eat, of nights spent stitching torn coats by lamplight, of holding feverish little bodies through endless hours, whispering comfort into the dark. "I used to warm their hands before school," Evelyn said, "even when mine were numb." Harold nodded. "You never complained, not once." She turned slightly toward him, her eyes reflecting dim light. "We did our best, didn't we?" He swallowed hard. "We did." Silence settled again, but it was not empty. A memory surfaced then, uninvited, sharp. Headlights cutting through falling snow, the hum of an engine idling too long. The way their son's voice had sounded strained, rushed. Evelyn's fingers tightened around Harold's sleeve. "He said it was just for a little while," she whispered. Harold closed his eyes. He could still hear it. The sound of the trunk closing, the car pulling away. They didn't say his name. They didn't need to. The silence answered for him. Outside, Daniel listened, heart heavy. He had heard stories like this before, different faces, same ending. But hearing it unfold in broken whispers made it harder to bear. He shifted closer to the tent, careful not to intrude. Rex lifted his head and looked back at him, eyes steady, understanding. Inside, Evelyn's breathing grew shallow. Daniel leaned in, adjusting the thermal wrap, pressing warmth back into her hands. She looked up at him, her gaze clear despite exhaustion. "You stayed," she murmured. He nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes softened. "You remind me of our boy," before life hardened him. Daniel didn't respond. Some wounds didn't need words. Time drifted strangely after that. Past and present blurred together as the wind whispered through the trees. Snow tapped gently against the tent like quiet fingers. Harold spoke again, his voice barely there. "Do you think anyone will come?" Daniel paused. He chose honesty, not cruelty, not comfort built on lies. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm here now." That was enough. The old man nodded, breathing steadying just slightly. Outside, Rex stood and turned toward the forest, ears lifting. His body stiffened, not in fear, but awareness. Something had shifted. Daniel followed his gaze, heart slowing, sharpening. The night was not over yet, but neither were they, and for the first time since the snow began to fall, the darkness felt less absolute. Memory did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, edges of sound, blurred movement, the echo of a voice trying to sound calm. Harold remembered the drive first. The car had been warm that day, warmer than it had any right to be in late autumn. Mark sat behind the wheel, hands steady, eyes fixed forward. He hadn't looked at them much during the drive, not even when his mother asked if they were going far. "Not far," he'd said. "Just somewhere quiet." His voice had been careful, measured. Too careful. Evelyn had noticed it then, the way he kept swallowing, the way his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. A son who had once talked endlessly now spoke only when necessary. The road narrowed as trees closed in around them. Snow had begun to fall, light at first, then thicker. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't because of traffic. It was because there was nowhere else to go. Mark stepped out quickly. He opened the trunk and pulled out the tent without a word. The fabric sagged in his hands, worn thin from years of storage. He placed it on the ground, then stepped back as if distance might soften what he was about to do. "It's quiet here," he said. "No one will bother you." Harold stared at him, confused. "Son, are you coming back?" Mark hesitated. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his cheek. He looked anywhere but at them. "I'll call," he said. "I just need some time." The words sounded practiced, rehearsed. Then he closed the trunk. The engine started. Gravel crunched beneath the tires, and without another word he drove away. He never looked back. Evelyn remembered reaching for his sleeve and grasping only cold air. "So it's just us," she whispered. Harold hadn't answered. He couldn't. The memory dissolved, leaving only the ache it always did. In the present, the forest seemed to hold its breath as the past settled between them. Evelyn's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She had cried enough in earlier years. This hurt was quieter, deeper. "They didn't mean to," she said softly, as if still protecting her children. "Life just got heavy." Harold didn't respond. He stared at the tent wall, jaw clenched. There was another child, too, a daughter. Her name was Anna. She had once been bright and stubborn, with chestnut hair that never stayed tied back and hands that trembled when she tried to hide her fear. She'd married young, too young, and into a life that closed in on her slowly. A husband who spoke softly in public and harshly in private. Bills that stacked higher than hope. Nights where she stared at her phone, wanting to call her parents, but afraid of what she might unleash if she did. She hadn't meant to abandon them. But fear can paralyze as deeply as cruelty. So she stayed silent, and silence did the rest. Back in the present, Daniel listened from just outside the tent, every word landing heavier than the snow above them. He'd heard stories like this before, but knowing didn't dull the weight of it. He had seen what fear did to people. He had lived it. Years ago, in a village halfway across the world, he'd frozen for half a second too long, just enough time for a friend not to make it back. That moment had never left him. It shaped how he moved, how he guarded himself, how he never turned his back on those who depended on him. Rex shifted beside him, sensing the shift in his breathing. "You hear that, too?" Daniel murmured. The dog's ears flicked, but he stayed calm. Inside the tent, Harold spoke again, voice low. "We didn't raise them wrong." Evelyn reached for his hand. "No," she said softly. "We just raised them to survive, and forgot to teach them how to stay." Silence followed, heavy but not empty. Outside, the wind eased. Snow fell slower. Daniel looked toward the dark path leading back to the road, the one the car had taken. It felt impossibly far now. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew one thing with certainty. They had been left behind, but they were not forgotten, not anymore. Morning arrived quietly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The storm had loosened its grip overnight, leaving the forest hushed beneath a pale sky. The road, once sealed by ice and fallen branches, had begun to open. Daniel noticed it first when the silence changed. Less pressure in the air, less resistance in his breath. He didn't waste time. With careful movements, he helped Harold to his feet, steadying him as weight shifted onto stiff legs. Evelyn followed slowly, leaning on Daniel's arm, her steps light but uncertain. Rex walked close beside her, his shoulder brushing her knee as if reminding her she wasn't alone. They moved carefully toward the old ranger shed near the trailhead. It wasn't much, just a converted storage building with patched walls and a roof that groaned in the wind, but it stood firm. It was shelter. Inside, warmth lingered faintly. Not heat, exactly, but the memory of it. The door creaked open, and with it came the first human voice they'd heard in days. "Oh, thank God." A woman stepped forward, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Her name was Martha, a woman in her late 50s, broad-shouldered and sturdy, with warm brown skin weathered by years of early mornings and long hours. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a loose bun, and her eyes carried the kind of kindness that had learned its limits without losing its heart. She ran a small, roadside diner a few miles down the mountain. Everyone knew her. Everyone trusted her. "Sit, all of you," she said gently. "Soup's still warm." The smell alone made Evelyn's knees tremble. Not long after, another figure entered, a tall man with careful movements and calm eyes. Evan, early 40s, once an emergency medical technician, now living quietly after burnout carved lines into his face. His beard was trimmed short, his voice soft but assured. He didn't ask many questions. He checked pulses, listened to breathing, wrapped blankets with practiced hands. "They're cold and exhausted," he said simply, "but they're fighters." Later came Lucas, a young park ranger with a lean frame and restless energy. His jacket still carried traces of pine and engine oil. He climbed onto a ladder without a word and began reinforcing the roof, sealing drafts, repairing what weather had nearly claimed. No one called it charity. No one made speeches. They moved as people do when they recognize something familiar in suffering. Night returned gently this time. Inside the shed, a small heater hummed. Bowls of soup steamed on a makeshift table. Evelyn ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might vanish. Harold sat straighter than he had in days, color returning faintly to his cheeks. Rex curled beside Evelyn's chair, head resting against her calf. She stroked his fur with trembling fingers. "You're warm," she whispered. He thumped his tail once. Daniel sat across from them, exhaustion pressing into his bones. He watched them eat, watched their breathing steady, and felt something inside him loosen. A knot he hadn't known was still tied. He had spent years believing survival meant isolation. That strength came from standing alone. Tonight proved otherwise. Later, as the others stepped out, Daniel helped Harold stand and walk a few careful steps. They moved slowly, but they moved. "Didn't think I could still do that," Harold said, voice cracking. "You're doing it," Daniel replied. "That's what matters." Evelyn lay down soon after. For the first time in days, her body softened into rest without fear tightening her chest. Her breathing evened out. Her hands relaxed. She slept. Truly slept. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, no longer threatening, just present. Daniel sat beside the door with Rex at his feet, watching the night deepen. For the first time in a long while, the forest did not feel empty. It felt held. And though none of them spoke it aloud, they all understood something had shifted. This wasn't rescue, it was the beginning of belonging. Morning light crept gently through the narrow windows of the old shed, pale and uncertain, like it wasn't sure it belonged there. Outside, the forest had softened. Snow still clung to the branches, but the air no longer bit. It only watched. Daniel stood near the door, arms folded, listening to the slow rhythm of breathing behind him. Evelyn slept deeper now, her chest rising evenly for the first time in days. Harold sat nearby, awake but calm, his hands resting on his knees as if afraid to disturb the peace. The stillness broke when footsteps approached. A young woman stood just beyond the doorway, holding a small camera in trembling hands. Her name was Emily Carter. She was in her mid-20s, slight in build, with soft brown hair pulled into a loose braid that slipped over one shoulder. Her skin carried the faint redness of someone who spent too much time outdoors, and her eyes, wide, observant, held a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. She wasn't a reporter. She didn't speak with urgency or polish. She was a local vlogger. Emily documented small-town life, closed shops reopening, forgotten people with forgotten stories. She'd been filming near the ranger station when she heard about the elderly couple pulled from the woods. Curiosity had led her here. Something deeper kept her from leaving. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't want to intrude. People should know." Daniel studied her for a moment. He had learned to read intention quickly. Hers was honest, nervous, but kind. "You can stay," he said. "Just don't turn them into a story." She nodded. "I won't." Her camera captured fragments. Not faces up close, not tears, but moments. The old tent folded beside the door, Rex lying protectively at Evelyn's feet, Martha setting down a bowl of soup with careful hands. Emily posted the video later that afternoon. She didn't expect what came next. Within hours, it spread. Thousands of views, then tens of thousands. People watched in silence. Then they spoke. Comments filled the screen. Grief, anger, disbelief. How could anyone do this? They deserved better. This could have been my parents. Hashtags followed like echoes. Left in the cold, they survived not alone. By evening, messages poured in offering blankets, food, shelter. Some asked where to help. Others simply said, "We see you." The world had noticed. And with attention came consequences. Mark arrived just before sunset. He stood near the edge of the clearing, holding an envelope in both hands. His hair was unkempt, his coat wrinkled. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of what he'd done had finally found him. "I brought money," he said, voice thin. For everything." Harold looked at the envelope, then at his son. "No," he said quietly. Mark swallowed. "Dad?" "No," Harold repeated, firmer now. "We don't need that." The rejection stung more than any accusation. Mark nodded, eyes wet, and stepped back. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He left the envelope on the ground and walked away. Later that evening, a phone rang. Evelyn answered. "Mom," a trembling voice whispered. It was Anna. She spoke in fragments, about fear, about nights spent listening for footsteps, about bruises hidden beneath sleeves. She cried without trying to stop herself. "I didn't know how to leave," she sobbed. "I didn't know how to help you when I couldn't even help myself." Evelyn closed her eyes. "I know," she said gently. "I know." No forgiveness was spoken, no promises made. But something shifted. A door cracked open, not wide enough to walk through, but wide enough to let light in. That night, Daniel stepped outside, letting the cold settle his thoughts. Rex followed, sitting beside him, steady and quiet. "You did good," Daniel murmured. The dog's tail tapped once against the ground. Inside, the world felt different. Not healed, not fixed, but awake. For the first time, the truth had been seen, and once seen, it could not be undone. Spring arrived without ceremony. Snow receded slowly, revealing patches of earth that had waited patiently beneath the cold. The forest no longer felt like a place of survival, but one of quiet renewal. Birds returned in cautious numbers. Light lingered longer in the evenings. So did people. What began as a few neighbors stopping by with blankets and warm meals became something steadier, almost intentional. The old ranger building, once forgotten, slowly transformed. Someone repaired the windows. Someone else painted the walls a soft, welcoming color. A donated heater hummed gently in the corner, no longer struggling to hold back the cold. Daniel watched it happen without ever claiming credit. He had never intended to build anything permanent. At first, he had only stayed because leaving felt wrong. But the more people came, the more he realized something rare was taking shape. Not rescue, not charity, but belonging. Rex adapted quickly. The 7-year-old German shepherd moved with a quiet dignity, his black and tan coat catching sunlight as he padded from room to room. Children gravitated toward him instinctively, and he responded with gentle patience, resting his head against trembling knees or curling beside anyone who sat too long in silence. The weight of his presence calmed storms no words could reach. Evelyn noticed first. She had grown stronger in the weeks since the forest, her steps steadier, her breath deeper. Her silver hair was now neatly brushed each morning, her eyes brighter, clearer. She began helping in the small kitchen, chopping vegetables, stirring soup with the same careful rhythm she once used when cooking for her children decades ago. Harold followed soon after. His hands still shook at times, but his back straightened with purpose. He repaired chairs, sanded old tables, and spoke with quiet humor to anyone who would listen. His laughter returned slowly, like a memory rediscovered. They had become something unexpected, anchors. People came not for shelter alone, but for the calm that seemed to live in the space around them. One afternoon, a woman arrived with her young daughter. Her name was Sarah. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with tired blue eyes and hair the color of wheat tied loosely at her neck. Her skin bore the faint bruises of exhaustion rather than violence, long nights, too many worries carried alone. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as if afraid to disturb the peace. Her daughter clung to her leg, small fingers tight in fabric. Sarah didn't explain much. She didn't need to. Evelyn knelt slowly and smiled at the child. "You're safe here," she said simply. The girl relaxed almost at once. More people followed. Not crowds, just those who had nowhere else to land. Daniel watched it all quietly. He repaired shelves, hauled supplies, listened more than he spoke. Some nights he sat outside with Rex, staring at the stars, feeling something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Peace, perhaps, or purpose. One afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Mark. He looked thinner, his face drawn, his posture hesitant. He didn't approach at first. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the life unfolding before him. Evelyn saw him first. She didn't rush, she didn't retreat. She simply waited. When Mark finally stepped forward, his voice trembled. "I don't know how to fix what I did." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. "You don't fix it," she said softly. "You show up." He nodded, tears streaking his face. Later that evening, Anna arrived as well. She looked different, tired, but standing taller. There were marks of a hard past in her posture, but also resolve. She helped serve food, spoke gently with others, and stayed. No apologies were demanded, no forgiveness rushed. Healing, it seemed, worked on its own time. As the sun set, Daniel watched the light stretch across the clearing. Voices mingled softly. Laughter rose, then settled. Rex lay at his feet, content. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something loosen inside him. Not relief, not closure, belonging. He finally understood what this place had become, not a shelter, not a refuge, but a beginning. And in the quiet that followed, one truth stood clear. Family is not defined by blood, but by those who refuse to leave when the world grows cold. Not every miracle arrives with thunder or light from the sky. Some arrive softly, through a stranger who stops, through hands that choose to help, through hearts that refuse to turn away. Perhaps this is how God works most often, not through grand signs, but through ordinary people who choose compassion when it would be easier to walk past suffering. This story is not only about survival, it is about love that endures when everything else is taken away, about faith that survives betrayal, about broken people becoming answers to one another's prayers. If this story touched your heart, it may be because someone, somewhere, is waiting for the same kindness you once needed, or still do. Maybe you are meant to be that light for someone walking through the cold. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment. Your words might reach a heart that feels unseen.